The night began with glitter. Chandeliers hung like constellations over the Grand Eden Hotel ballroom, their crystal arms catching the light in 1,000 fragments. The air was rich with perfume, laughter, and the faint clink of champagne glasses. It should have been a night about charity, about children's futures, about goodwill. But instead, it became the stage for a betrayal so cruel, so brazen, that whispers of it would ripple through the city for years to come. Mason Hart entered with the arrogance of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His tuxedo was custom-tailored, his smile wide and confident. But what drew every eye in the room was not Mason himself. It was the woman at his side, Tasha Carrington. She was not the kind of woman the city's elite expected to see on the arm of a rising executive. She was heavier than the delicate models who usually floated through such events, her gown clinging tightly to her frame. She laughed loudly, unapologetically, her cheeks flushed with champagne. To many in the room she seemed out of place among the sequins and diamonds. Whispers began instantly. "Isn't Mason's wife pregnant? Who is she? She doesn't fit. That's Tasha Carrington, Victor Carrington's daughter." And there it was, the reason Mason had made his choice. For weeks, rumors had swirled that Mason was leaving his wife, Elena, even though she was 6 months pregnant with their first child. Tonight, those rumors crystallized into reality. Elena was nowhere to be seen. In her place stood Tasha, clinging to Mason's arm like a declaration of war. Mason raised his glass for the cameras, his voice carrying across the hall. "To new beginnings," he said smoothly. "To futures brighter than the past." The words struck like a knife in the hearts of those who remembered Elena, the quiet schoolteacher who had supported him from the shadows, the woman who had given up her career for his. Some pitied her, others scorned her weakness, but Mason didn't care. For him, Elena was already erased. Later that night, in a quieter corner of the ballroom, Mason leaned close to a colleague, his voice dripping with smugness. "Elena's future is tied to diapers and bills. Mine is tied to Carrington Enterprises. You'll see. This," he gestured to Tasha, who was laughing with another guest, "is my ticket to the top. The future of Mason Hart isn't in my wife's belly. It's in Victor Carrington's empire." The colleague raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Mason's ambition was no secret. Still, to hear him dismiss his pregnant wife so coldly left even hardened businessmen unsettled. Mason didn't notice. Or rather, he didn't care. He saw only the prize ahead of him, Victor Carrington, the billionaire who ruled boardrooms with an iron fist. To Mason, Tasha was not a woman to love. She was a bridge to power, to wealth, to immortality in the world of finance. What Mason didn't realize was that the bridge he thought so sturdy was already cracking beneath his feet. Because while Mason smirked and preened, Victor Carrington himself had arrived. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, silver hair gleaming under the lights, his presence commanding silence. He didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply watched. And in his eyes, there was no pride in seeing his daughter on Mason's arm. There was only fire. Meanwhile, across town, Elena Hart sat in a small apartment, folding tiny clothes into neat piles. The television flickered silently in the background, the evening news replaying images of the gala. Her hands trembled as she caught a glimpse of Mason with Tasha. Her heart sank as if a weight had been dropped upon it. The apple pie she had baked earlier sat untouched on the counter. She had once thought Mason loved it, loved her, loved the life they had built together. Now, staring at the screen, she realized the truth. He had traded her in for a future she could never compete with. Her hand rested on her belly. The baby kicked softly, a fragile reminder that she wasn't alone. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I'm sorry, little one. I thought your father would choose us, but he already chose his empire." Back at the gala, Mason clinked glasses with Tasha, smiling for the cameras, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He thought he had won. He thought abandoning Elena and flaunting Tasha was a victory. But the city was already talking, already judging, already questioning. And Victor Carrington, the man Mason believed he was impressing, was watching every move with the cold patience of a predator. Because Mason hadn't just abandoned his wife that night, he had declared war on the wrong family. And the consequences would be far greater than he could ever imagine. Elena Hart had never imagined her life would turn into a spectacle for strangers to dissect. Just a year ago, She had been a woman of quiet dreams and simple joys, content with the life she was building with Mason. At 31, she wasn't glamorous, she wasn't wealthy, and she certainly wasn't chasing power. What she wanted was far more ordinary and far more profound. A home filled with love, laughter, and the sound of a child's footsteps on the floorboards. She grew up in a small Midwestern town, raised by her mother after her father disappeared before Elena could remember his face. Her mother, Maria, was a woman of grit and sacrifice. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses by day and sewing clothes by night, to keep food on the table. Elena watched her mother's hands crack from soap and needles. Yet those same hands always had the strength to hold her tightly when life hurt too much. From her mother, Elena learned 2 lessons. Survival comes from resilience, and dignity is something no one can take unless you give it away. She carried those lessons into adulthood, putting herself through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. Teaching was her dream, and when she stood in front of a classroom filled with children who looked at her as if she held the world in her hands, she felt complete. She wanted to shape futures, just as one teacher once shaped hers. Then Mason appeared. He wasn't extraordinary at first glance, a young man in a crisp shirt, ordering coffee in the diner where Elena worked nights to pay for her books. But he had confidence, and to a woman who had always carried responsibility like a second skin, his charm felt intoxicating. Mason made her laugh, left her notes scribbled on napkins, waited outside her shift with his car parked under the dim yellow streetlights. Against her better judgment, Elena let herself be swept away. Within 2 years, they were married. The ceremony was modest, white roses borrowed from a neighbor's garden, a second-hand lace gown passed down from Maria, but Elena didn't care. What mattered was the promise. Forever. Mason whispered it against her ear that night, and she believed him. For a time, their life was peaceful. Elena put her teaching dreams aside to support Mason's career, believing in his ambition. She kept their home warm, their bills paid, their lives steady. When he came home late, she told herself it was because he worked so hard for their future. When he grew impatient, snapping at her for little things, she told herself stress was to blame. She loved him enough to excuse the cracks. When she found out she was pregnant, Elena felt as though the universe had given her the missing piece of her soul. She decorated the nursery herself, painting soft yellows on the walls, sewing sunflower curtains late at night with tired but joyful hands. She pressed her palm against her belly every evening, whispering promises to the little life growing inside. But Mason did not share her joy. Where Elena saw hope, Mason saw chains. He began to look at her swollen ankles, her stretched skin, her weary eyes, and saw not the woman who had sacrificed for him, but a burden. He compared her to the women at Gallus, slim, glittering, childless, and resented the quiet strength of the wife who once stood by him through every storm. Elena noticed. She noticed the late nights, the cold distance, the way his laughter no longer reached his eyes. But she convinced herself he would come back to her, that once he held their child, his heart would soften again. She was wrong. The night Mason walked out, he didn't bother with lies. He told her straight, his voice devoid of shame. Elena, you don't fit the life I want anymore. Tasha does. She comes from power, from a family that matters. You're just ordinary, and I can't build an empire with ordinary. The words hollowed her out. She stood frozen, her hand pressed against her belly as if shielding the child from the cruelty of their father. Mason packed a bag, kissed her cheek like she was nothing more than a neighbor, and walked out. In the weeks that followed, Elena tried to piece herself together. She worked part-time tutoring to keep herself busy, but every night she returned to the silence of their small apartment. The baby's kicks reminded her she wasn't entirely alone, but loneliness seeped into her bones like winter frost. Then came the humiliation. The newspapers, the gossip columns, the photographs of Mason parading Tasha across ballrooms, whispering about the power couple of tomorrow. Elena, still pregnant, still trying to breathe, became a ghost in her own story. But what Mason never understood was this. Elena was not weak. Yes, she cried into her pillow. Yes, she broke down in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she tried to cook dinner she couldn't eat. Yes, she felt abandoned and worthless. But inside her ran the same blood as Maria. the blood of women who endured storms and rose stronger after. One morning, she stood before the bathroom mirror, her hair tangled, her eyes swollen from tears. She barely recognized herself. But then her baby kicked hard, almost defiantly, and she realized she didn't have the luxury of breaking. She pressed her hand against her belly and whispered, "I won't let him take us down, I promise." That was the moment something shifted inside her. The grief was still there, heavy and sharp, but it was now joined by something fiercer: resolve. Mason had written her off as ordinary, but he had no idea that ordinary women often carried the most extraordinary strength. And when Elena learned the full truth about Mason's betrayal, she would discover that the power to end him was already in her hands. The city was a place of contradictions, where glittering towers of glass touched the clouds, while shadows of forgotten alleyways swallowed the desperate below. It was here, in this metropolis of power and illusion, that Mason Hart believed he could reinvent himself. He wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder anymore, he was clawing his way into the world of billionaires, boardrooms, and whispered deals sealed over crystal glasses of scotch. For Mason, the gateway to this world wasn't talent or innovation, it was Tasha Carrington. By attaching himself to her, he thought he had found a shortcut into Victor Carrington's empire. And nowhere was this duplicity clearer than in the grand galas that lit up the city like jeweled crowns. The Grand Eden Hotel was one such place, a palace of marble staircases, golden chandeliers, and velvet drapes. These galas weren't just parties, they were battlegrounds disguised as celebrations. Men and women in designer suits and gowns mingled not for joy but for strategy. Every laugh was calculated, every toast a negotiation. Fortunes shifted with the clink of a glass, and reputations were built or destroyed in a whisper. It was in these halls that Mason paraded Tasha on his arm, presenting her as both trophy and ticket. She was his statement to the world. "I belong here, I have arrived." The irony was sharp. Guests looked at Tasha, her sequin dresses straining against her figure, her loud laugh cutting through the music, and some snickered behind their champagne glasses. To them, she was out of place, the odd jewel in a flawless crown. Yet they dared not mock her openly, not when her father was Victor Carrington. Mason fed off that silence. To him, every forced smile, every reluctant nod of acknowledgement was proof that he was winning. He would lean into Tasha's ear, whispering compliments that made her giggle, while his eyes scanned the room for investors, executives, anyone worth charming. But across town, the other side of the world existed. Elena's world. Her apartment was small, modest, with peeling paint on the kitchen walls and second-hand furniture bought with careful budgeting. The nursery she had prepared was simple but full of love. Sunflower curtains, soft toys donated by friends, a rocking chair placed beside the crib. To Elena, these small things were treasures. To Mason, they had been chains. The stark contrast between the two worlds could not have been greater. Mason thrived in marble and gold. Elena survived in warmth and simplicity. He courted power, she cradled hope. Yet despite the differences, both worlds were now tied together by one truth. Elena's child and Tasha's child, two women, both carrying futures. Mason believed he could manipulate for his own gain. At the galas, Mason pretended Elena didn't exist. When journalists whispered about his pregnant wife, he dismissed them with a smirk. "She'll be fine," he said casually. "She'll manage. I've moved on." His words, laced with arrogance, rippled across newspapers and gossip columns. Elena saw those headlines in the grocery store, her hands tightening on the handle of her cart. Strangers glanced at her belly, whispering, pitying, some even judging. She wanted to scream at them that she was more than the woman Mason abandoned, that her child was not a mistake, but a miracle. Instead, she paid for her groceries quietly and walked home with her head high, even as her heart broke inside. The city itself seemed to mock her. Billboards showed luxury cars Mason dreamed of owning. Advertisements flashed designer brands he draped on Tasha. Meanwhile, Elena counted every dollar, worried about medical bills, about diapers, about the future she would have to provide alone. But what neither Mason nor the city realized was that Elena's modest world carried something Mason's golden halls never would: authenticity. Because while Mason's world was built on lies, appearances, and borrowed power, Elena's was built on resilience, sacrifice, and truth. The setting of their lives had split into two distinct arenas, Mason's glittering illusion and Alina's quiet reality. But soon, those worlds would collide in a storm neither could avoid, and the center of that storm would be Victor Carrington's empire. Victor had spent decades crafting a kingdom where weakness was devoured and betrayal was punished. He watched Mason's antics with growing fury, his silence not approval, but calculation. He loved his daughter, flawed though she was, and while he disapproved of her recklessness, he would not allow a parasite like Mason to turn her into a tool. Victor's empire was not one Mason could buy into with charm alone. It was forged in blood, sacrifice, and ruthless decisions. Mason thought himself cunning, but compared to Victor, he was a boy playing with matches in a house full of gasoline. The city would soon learn that Mason's gamble, trading a loyal wife for a wealthy mistress, was not a triumph, but a death sentence. And Elena, the woman he thought too ordinary, too powerless, would soon step out of her small apartment and into the halls of marble and gold. Because in this city of two faces, the quiet wife and the loud mistress were about to become the keys to Mason's downfall. Mason Hart had always been ambitious, but ambition without conscience is nothing more than hunger dressed in a suit. To those who first met him, Mason was charming. He knew how to shake a hand firmly, how to flash a smile that seemed sincere, how to make promises he never intended to keep. He could sell confidence the way a con artist sells dreams, but beneath that polished exterior lived a man consumed by insecurity. Mason had grown up in an average household, neither rich nor poor, but painfully ordinary. And ordinary was a word Mason despised. From a young age, he envied those who had more, nicer cars, bigger houses, powerful fathers who opened doors their sons barely had to knock on. Mason swore he would never settle for less, even if it meant stepping on everyone who loved him. For a while, Elena blinded him to that hunger. She was gentle, devoted, and willing to sacrifice her own dreams so that he could chase his. With her by his side, Mason looked stable, respectable, trustworthy. But as soon as her belly grew, as soon as responsibility overshadowed glamour, Mason began to see her differently. To him, Elena represented the life he had fought to escape. Simple, modest, ordinary. And Mason wanted extraordinary. That's when Tasha Carrington appeared. To the world, she was easy to mock. Too loud, too heavy, too brash. But Mason didn't see Tasha for who she was. He saw the last name, Carrington. He saw the key to an empire worth billions. He didn't love her. He didn't even desire her. But he understood the power she represented. If he could marry Tasha, he wouldn't just be a man climbing ladders. He'd be a man who married into the very family that built the ladders. With one reckless gamble, he could bypass years of struggle and crown himself a king. So Mason made his choice. He filed for divorce from Elena, abandoning her while she carried his child, and walked into galas with Tasha on his arm. Every laugh he gave her, every kiss on the cheek, every whispered promise, it was all performance. A show for Victor Carrington, to prove that he was worthy of the empire. But Mason underestimated two things: Victor's ruthless intelligence and Elena's quiet strength. Behind closed doors, Mason's true nature was crueler still. With Elena, he mocked her simplicity. "You'll never understand this world," he sneered once, waving a glossy magazine of business tycoons. "You're content with pennies while I'm chasing millions." He reduced her love to weakness, her sacrifices to burdens. With Tasha, his cruelty was subtler. He showered her with attention in public, but in private, he rolled his eyes at her laughter, ridiculed her insecurities, and reminded her that she was lucky to have him. "Do you really think men line up for you?" he once hissed when she questioned his late-night absences. "Without me, you'd still be hiding in your father's shadow." Mason thrived on control. He believed women existed to serve his ambition, Elena for stability, Tasha for power. But arrogance breeds blindness, and Mason was blind to the storm he was stirring. What made Mason dangerous wasn't just his betrayal, it was his shamelessness. He didn't hide the affair, didn't try to protect Elena's dignity. He flaunted Tasha publicly, parading her belly in front of flashing cameras while Elena wept in silence at home. Mason wanted the world to see. To him, humiliation wasn't collateral damage, it was strategy. And yet Mason's greatest crime wasn't abandoning Elena or exploiting Tasha. His greatest crime was the one he thought no one would discover. In his desperation to appear wealthier than he was, Mason had forged Alina's signature on a series of financial documents. He funneled money through her name, disguising fraud as joint investments. If his scheme ever collapsed, Alina would take the fall, while Mason slipped free. He saw her as nothing more than a shield against accountability. This was Mason, a man who betrayed his wife, exploited his mistress, and gambled his own child's future, all for the illusion of power. But illusions never last. At the gala, when Victor Carrington's icy words cut through the ballroom, Mason's mask cracked. His smirk faltered, his palms sweated, his eyes darted. For the first time, the man who believed himself untouchable realized he had walked into a cage built by his own greed. Still, Mason convinced himself he could win. He told Tasha that her father would forgive, that Elena would fade away, that the city would forget. He whispered lies as if repeating them could make them true. But Victor Carrington wasn't a man who forgot, and Elena wasn't a woman who stayed down. Mason believed he had secured his empire, but what he had really done was light the match that would burn everything he ever built. And when Mason finally faced Victor in private, he would hear words that shattered the illusion of his control forever. The night of the gala was supposed to be Mason's crowning moment. He had spent weeks rehearsing lines in front of mirrors, perfecting his smile, choosing the right tuxedo. Tasha wore an emerald gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, her hair styled in loose curls. Together, Mason believed they would silence every whisper, every doubt. Tonight, the city would see them as the new power couple, the heirs to the Carrington name. The ballroom glowed with gold and glass. Waiters in crisp white jackets served champagne, while cameras flashed like lightning storms. Investors, journalists, and politicians mingled, each one a witness to Mason's carefully staged performance. He clasped Tasha's hand firmly, guiding her through the crowd with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Smile," he whispered under his breath. "They need to see strength." Tasha obeyed, her laugh echoing too loudly across the marble floor. She wanted to believe Mason loved her, wanted to believe his touch meant more than strategy. Deep down, though, she felt the unease. Her father's shadow loomed large, and Mason's eyes never seemed to rest on her. They scanned the room for opportunity. Then, as the orchestra played a waltz, the doors to the ballroom opened. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned, and there she was, Elena. She wore a simple navy gown, her belly round and unmistakable beneath the fabric. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale but steady. Every step she took into that glittering hall was a step of defiance. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to remain hidden, forgotten, erased. But Elena had come. The whispers exploded instantly. "That's Mason's wife. She's pregnant. Didn't he file for divorce already? Oh my God, both of them are carrying his children?" Mason froze. His grip on Tasha's hand tightened until she winced. The cameras turned, abandoning him and Tasha for Elena, who now stood at the center of the ballroom, her presence a silent accusation. For weeks, Mason had controlled the narrative. He was the ambitious man moving forward. Elena, the relic of his past. But tonight, the truth could not be hidden. 2 women, 2 pregnancies, one man's arrogance laid bare. The journalists surged, microphones flashing. "Mr. Hart, care to comment?" one shouted. "Who is your rightful family, the wife or the mistress?" Mason tried to recover, plastering a smile on his face. "This is not the place for personal matters," he said, his voice strained. "We are here for the children's charity, not gossip." But the irony was too much. A reporter called out, "Then why abandon your own child for charity?" Laughter, gasps, murmurs, it was chaos. Elena stood silently, her hands resting on her belly, her eyes meeting Mason's across the hall. There was no hatred in them, only quiet strength. That strength made him sweat more than any insult could. And then, Victor Carrington entered. The room shifted instantly. Conversation stopped, the orchestra faltered, even the waiters froze mid-step. Victor's silver hair gleamed under the lights, his broad shoulders commanding space no one dared to challenge. He walked slowly, deliberately, his cane tapping against the marble floor, though he did not need it. Mason straightened, forcing a smile. "Victor," he said too loudly, "I'm glad you're here." But Victor's eyes never moved to Mason. They went first to Elena. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable, then gave the slightest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Then his eyes shifted to his daughter. Tasha's smile faltered. "Father," she whispered, but he did not respond. His gaze finally landed on Mason, and it was colder than ice. Victor requested the microphone from the host. No one refused him. The room fell into silence as he stepped onto the stage. "Tonight," Victor began, his voice deep and steady, "we gather to honor children, to build a future for them." "But how can we speak of futures if men cannot even honor their own children?" The words struck like thunder. Mason's face drained of color. Victor continued, his tone sharp as steel. "It has come to my attention that a man in this room believes he can discard his pregnant wife and flaunt another woman as his prize. This man believes he can gamble with lives for his own ambition. He believes he can use my daughter as a stepping stone into my empire." Gasps rippled across the room. Tasha's eyes widened, tears filling them. Mason grabbed her arm, hissing, "Stay calm," but his own voice trembled. Victor's gaze locked on Mason, unblinking. "You, Mason Hart, have humiliated not just your wife, not just my daughter, but the very idea of family. And for that, you will pay." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, investors whispered furiously. Some guests clapped at Victor's words. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Mason tried to shout above the noise. "This is a misunderstanding. I love Tasha. Elena means nothing to me anymore." But that was his final mistake. The words echoed through the microphones, recorded by every journalist in the room. He had declared, in front of the world, that his pregnant wife, the woman who had given him everything, was nothing. Elena's chest tightened, but she lifted her chin higher. She refused to break. Not here, not now. And then, in the midst of the uproar, Victor stepped down from the stage. He walked directly to Elena, the crowd parting for him as if he were Moses splitting the sea. He stopped in front of her, placed a firm hand on her shoulder, and whispered words no one else could hear. Elena's eyes widened, her lips trembling. Because in that moment, Victor revealed a secret that would not only destroy Mason's ambitions, but also change the course of Elena's life forever. The night of the gala replayed in Elena's mind like a cruel film she couldn't switch off. Everywhere she turned, in newspapers, on TV, even whispered in the aisles of grocery stores, her name was tangled with Mason's betrayal. Strangers who had never met her dissected her pain as if it were entertainment. When she returned home from the gala, she didn't speak. She simply closed the door behind her, slid down to the floor, and sat in silence. The navy gown clung to her, as if mocking her attempt to hold dignity in a room that had devoured it. Her belly pressed forward beneath the fabric, a reminder that she was carrying a life Mason had already rejected. For days, she hardly left her apartment. Curtains stayed drawn, meals went uneaten. The nursery she had lovingly painted felt like a cruel joke now. The sunflower curtains, bright and cheerful, in a room filled with despair. She would sit in the rocking chair, cradling her belly, whispering apologies to her child. "I wanted us to be a family," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I thought love was enough. I was wrong." The pressure mounted inside her. At night, she tossed in bed, jolted awake by nightmares. Mason laughing as he walked away, Mason tearing her baby from her arms, Mason's cold words echoing, "You mean nothing." Her body began to suffer under the strain. Her ankles swelled, headaches throbbed behind her eyes, and her blood pressure spiked dangerously high. At her doctor's appointment, the physician frowned and said firmly, "Elena, stress at this level is dangerous. You must rest. You must find peace for your sake and your baby's." But how could she rest when her world had collapsed? Meanwhile, Mason's face was plastered across headlines, businessman humiliated in scandal. 2 women, 2 pregnancies, 1 man's arrogance. Elena couldn't escape it. Every headline was a fresh cut, every photo of Mason with Tasha a reminder of her replacement. She told herself to be strong, to rise above. But strength felt like a distant memory. She wept over dishes in the sink, over a half-cooked dinner, over the quiet ticking of the clock. The apartment became her prison, filled with ghosts of what her life was supposed to be. One evening, a storm raged outside. Thunder shook the windows, rain pounded the glass. Elena sat on the bathroom floor, her knees pulled to her chest despite the swell of her belly. Her sobs were swallowed by the sound of rain. She whispered into the darkness, "Why wasn't I enough? Why wasn't our love enough?" Her reflection in the bathroom mirror was almost unrecognizable. Pale skin, hollow eyes, lips trembling. She barely saw herself anymore. Her phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up. She almost ignored it, convinced it was another cruel headline or a pitying text from someone who didn't understand. But something made her reach for it. The message was brief, from an unknown number. Mason does not love my daughter. He is using her. Meet me. You deserve to know the truth. Her breath caught. The initials at the end froze her blood. VC Victor Carrington. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. Victor was a name that commanded fear across the city, a man who crushed empires with a single decision. Why would he reach out to her? The woman Mason abandoned, the woman his daughter despised. She dropped the phone onto the counter, pacing the small bathroom. Could she trust him? Or was this just another trap, another manipulation in a game too big for her to understand? Her baby kicked sharply, as if demanding her attention. Elena pressed her hand to her belly, tears spilling down her cheeks. You deserve the truth, the message had said. And deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and despair, Elena knew it was true. Mason's betrayal was bigger than she had realized. There were lies she hadn't uncovered, secrets she hadn't been told. She couldn't keep living blind to them. But fear rooted her in place. Victor Carrington was ruthless. He wasn't a man to approach lightly. If she stepped into his world, there would be no going back. The storm outside raged harder, lightning flashing across the sky. Elena stood in the bathroom doorway, staring into the darkness of her apartment, the choice looming before her. She could stay here, hidden, broken, forgotten, or she could step into Victor's world and uncover the truth Mason had buried. Her phone buzzed again, another message. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Carrington Tower, come alone. Elena closed her eyes, her body trembling with fear and resolve, because tomorrow she would step into Victor Carrington's world, and nothing about her life or her child's future would ever be the same again. The Carrington Tower loomed above the city like a monument to power. Its glass walls reflected the morning sun, blinding and beautiful, yet intimidating in their perfection. Elena stood at the base of it, her palms damp with sweat, her heart pounding as if it wanted to escape her chest. She clutched her purse tightly, her other hand instinctively resting on her belly. She felt so small here. A schoolteacher's daughter, an abandoned wife, a woman who had been made into a headline. What was she doing walking into the lair of a billionaire who could destroy reputations with a phone call? But the text had been clear. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Carrington Tower, come alone. So here she was. The receptionist greeted her politely, but with a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Elena knew she must have seen the scandal splashed across the news. Still, she said nothing, simply directed Elena to the private elevator that led straight to the top floor. The doors opened to an office unlike anything Elena had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire wall, offering a sweeping view of the city. The furniture was sleek but understated. Dark wood, leather chairs, a single painting of a stormy sea, and behind a massive desk sat Victor Carrington. He didn't stand at first. He simply studied her with piercing eyes that seemed to see through every layer of her being. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, commanding. Elena Hart. She swallowed hard. Mr. Carrington. Sit. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the leather chair across from him. Her hands trembled in her lap, but she tried to hide it. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, watching her as if measuring her worth. Then, finally, you have been humiliated. The bluntness stung, but Elena didn't flinch. Yes, she whispered. You've been betrayed, he continued. Yes. And yet, you walked into this tower anyway. His eyes narrowed slightly. That tells me you are not as weak as Mason believed. Her throat tightened at the mention of Mason's name. Why am I here, Mr. Carrington? Victor rose then, moving to the window. His broad shoulders cast a shadow across the room. Because Mason Hart is a fool. He thinks he can use my daughter as a pawn, and in doing so, he has insulted me. But more than that, he has placed you in danger. Elena frowned. Danger? How? Victor turned, his expression dark. Mason has been moving money through fraudulent accounts. He forged signatures, falsified contracts, and used your name to shield himself. If the law uncovers it, you will take the fall. Her blood ran cold. My name? He used me? Victor nodded grimly. Yes, on paper, you are the guilty party, not him. Elena's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. Betrayal was one thing, but to discover Mason had not only abandoned her but also tried to ruin her, it was almost too much to bear. Victor's voice cut through her spiral of panic. That is why you are here. You need to understand the truth. Mason never loved you. He never loved my daughter. He loves only himself, and he will sacrifice anyone to feed his hunger for power. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She refused to let Victor see her break. Why are you telling me this? Why me? Victor's expression softened, if only slightly. Because you are the key to destroying him. Mason believes you are broken, forgotten. He does not realize that you hold the very evidence that can end him. He returned to his desk and slid a folder across to her. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were copies of contracts, bank statements, and signatures, her signature faked in neat practice strokes. Her vision blurred with rage. He signed my name. He made me his scapegoat. Victor nodded once. Exactly. And if you do nothing, he will bury you with his sins. Elena's heart pounded. She thought of her child, of the life she wanted to build. Mason had already stolen her peace, her dignity. She could not let him steal her future too. Victor's gaze was sharp as a blade. You have a choice. Walk away and Mason wins, or stand with me and we destroy him together. Elena stared at the folder, at the proof of Mason's betrayal laid bare. Her tears dried, replaced with something fiercer. For the first time in months, she felt fire in her veins. What do you need me to do? She asked. Victor allowed himself the faintest smile. First, you need to decide who you are. The abandoned wife Mason discarded, or the woman who will make him regret underestimating you. Elena drew a deep breath, her hand resting protectively on her belly. For her child, for herself, for every sleepless night of shame, she knew the answer. I will not be his victim, she said firmly. Not anymore. Victor's eyes gleamed. Good. Then listen carefully, because Mason's time is running out. And when Victor revealed the first step of his plan, Elena realized she was about to become someone Mason would never see coming. The morning after her meeting with Victor Carrington, Elena stood before the mirror in her small apartment and barely recognized herself. Her reflection was tired, pale, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. But beneath the exhaustion flickered something Mason had never seen in her. Determination. She had been broken, yes, but she was not finished. Victor had given her a choice, and she had made it. She would not remain Mason's victim. She would rise not only for herself, but for the child she carried. The transformation began quietly. Victor's assistant, Claudia, appeared at Elena's door with garment bags, makeup cases, and a team of stylists. Mr. Carrington asked me to prepare you, Claudia said curtly, though her eyes softened when she saw the modest apartment. If you're going to fight Mason, you can't walk into battle looking defeated. Elena hesitated at first. She had never cared for fashion or glamour. But when the stylist draped a tailored gown across her shoulders, when they brushed color back into her cheeks and styled her hair into waves, something inside her shifted. For the first time in months, she looked at her reflection and didn't see a discarded wife. She saw a woman capable of standing in the spotlight without flinching. But the transformation wasn't just physical. Victor arranged for Elena to meet with lawyers, advisors, and even media coaches. She learned the details of Mason's fraud, studied the documents he had forged, and prepared herself for the inevitable storm. At first, the information overwhelmed her, pages of numbers and contracts blurring together. But she forced herself to learn, to understand, to reclaim control over the life Mason had tried to manipulate. She practiced speaking with confidence, her voice steady, her words sharp. She learned how to answer reporters without crumbling, how to tell her story without sounding like a victim. One afternoon, she sat across from Victor in his office, rehearsing. Say it again, he instructed. Elena lifted her chin. Mason Hart betrayed me. He forged my name to cover his crimes. He thought I would break, but I won't. Victor studied her, then nodded. Good. But remember, Elena, this isn't just about punishing him. This is about reclaiming your life. Speak not with anger, but with conviction. She took his words to heart. The press had been hounding her for weeks, desperate for a statement. At last, with Victor's guidance, she agreed to one interview. It wasn't with a tabloid or gossip magazine, but with a respected journalist who valued integrity. Elena appeared in a soft, flowing gown, her hair simple but elegant, her hands resting protectively on her belly. When asked about Mason, she didn't lash out. She didn't cry. Instead, she looked directly into the camera and said, "A man can abandon his wife, a man can abandon responsibility, but he cannot erase the truth. My child and I will not be silenced." The words reverberated far beyond the studio. They went viral within hours, shared across news outlets, social media, and talk shows. Women across the country reached out with messages of support. Some wrote, "You spoke for all of us who have been betrayed." Others said, "You reminded me that I can stand again too." For the first time since Mason left, Alina felt something other than despair. She felt purpose. Meanwhile, Mason's empire crumbled. Investors withdrew, partners distanced themselves, and Tasha, once his ticket to power, began to see the truth. The whispers behind closed doors grew louder. Mason Hart was not a visionary but a fraud. Alina didn't revel in his downfall. She didn't need revenge. What she needed was to reclaim herself. And with each passing day, she did. She walked into Carrington Tower, no longer as a frightened woman seeking answers, but as a partner in a mission. Victor introduced her to influential allies, not as Mason's abandoned wife, but as Alina Hart, the woman who had endured betrayal and emerged stronger. At one charity luncheon, she entered the room in a navy dress that flowed like water. Conversations hushed as she passed, but this time, the whispers were different. "She carries herself like royalty," one guest murmured. "She's stronger than I expected," another whispered. Alina heard them but didn't flinch. She walked taller, her hand resting on her belly, her child a symbol not of weakness, but of resilience. At home, she opened a box of old teaching certificates and letters from students she had once taught. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were of recognition. She had given up her dreams for Mason, but now she realized she could rebuild, not just as a mother, but as herself. Late one night, as rain pattered against her window, she whispered to her unborn child, "We're stronger than he ever believed, and soon he'll know it." Victor agreed. One evening, as they met to discuss strategy, he told her, "You've risen, Elena, but Mason still thinks you are weak. He needs to see you as you are now, and the world needs to see it too." "How?" she asked. "The next gala," Victor replied. "He will be there, desperate to salvage what's left of his reputation. You will be there too, not as his abandoned wife, not as a victim, but as the woman who has already won." Elena's heart pounded. The thought of standing in the same room as Mason again made her stomach twist. But deep down, she knew this was her destiny. She had hidden long enough. Her transformation was nearly complete. She was no longer defined by betrayal, but by the strength she had forged through it. And at the next gala, Elena would step into the spotlight, not as Mason's shadow, but as the flame that would burn his empire to the ground. The Grand Eden Hotel shimmered once again, its chandeliers casting golden light across a sea of polished marble. Another gala, another night of power and spectacle. But this time, the whispers before the event were louder than the music. Everyone knew what tonight was about. Mason Hart would be there, desperate to claw back what remained of his reputation. And Elena Hart, the wife he discarded, was rumored to attend as well. The city buzzed with anticipation. Would she hide? Would she confront him? The crowd arrived not just for charity, but for blood. Mason appeared first, striding into the ballroom in a sharp black tuxedo. His smile was wide, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. The scandal had worn him down, his once perfect image cracked. Still, he clung to Tasha's arm, dragging her into the light as if her presence alone could legitimize him. She looked uncomfortable, her gown glittering too brightly under the cameras, her hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. Reporters surged. "Mr. Hart, how do you respond to the allegations? Are you still married to Elena? Which child will inherit your name?" Mason raised a hand, pretending calm. "Tonight is not about personal matters," he said smoothly. "It's about building futures. Let's stay focused on what matters." But no one bought it. The room smelled blood. And then the doors opened again. Elena entered. She wore a crimson gown that flowed behind her like fire, her hair swept back, her eyes steady. The swell of her belly was visible, but instead of weakness, it radiated strength. The crowd gasped as cameras exploded in flashes. Elena did not shrink. She walked with dignity, her hand resting protectively on her child, her chin lifted high. She was not the abandoned wife anymore. She was a queen reclaiming her throne. The whispers surged. She looks magnificent. She's stronger than ever. Mason's finished. Mason's face paled. His smirk faltered as he gripped Tasha's hand tighter. Ignore her, he muttered, but his voice trembled. The evening unfolded in tension. Speeches were made, music played, but everyone's eyes were on the inevitable collision. When Mason was called to the stage to deliver his address, his voice cracked under the weight of silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that my commitment to this city is unwavering. Despite rumors? Rumors? Elena's voice cut through the hall like a blade. She was standing now, every eye turning to her. Calmly, deliberately, she walked toward the stage. The crowd parted for her, whispers like a rising tide. Mason froze as she mounted the steps, her gown shimmering in the spotlight. She faced not him, but the audience. For weeks, you've heard whispers. Tonight, I will show you the truth. From her clutch, she pulled a folder. Her hands were steady, her voice unwavering. These are documents Mason Hart signed with my forged name. He funneled money through false accounts, using me as a shield for his crimes. He didn't just betray his wife. He betrayed the law. Gasps erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning. Journalists surged forward, shouting questions. Mason lunged for the folder, panic overtaking him. "You're lying," he shouted, his face twisted. "This is slander." But before he could snatch it away, a firm hand caught his wrist. Victor Carrington. The room fell silent as Victor rose to the stage, his presence commanding all attention. His voice boomed. "Touch her, and you'll regret it." Mason froze, trembling. Victor addressed the crowd. "These documents are already with the authorities. Mason Hart has not only humiliated his family, he has committed crimes that will destroy him. And let it be clear, he will never be part of my empire." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Some applauded, others gasped. Reporters shouted over one another. Mason stumbled, his face ashen. He looked to Tasha for support, but she stepped back, her eyes wet with tears. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Did you ever love me? Or was I just a tool for you?" Mason stammered, reaching for her, but she pulled away. "I thought you saw me, Mason. But you only ever saw my father's name." Her words cut deeper than any headline. Mason was alone now, abandoned by the woman he exploited, exposed by the wife he betrayed, destroyed by the father he had tried to manipulate. Elena turned to him at last, her voice calm but lethal. "You thought I was weak, you thought I would break. But Mason, this is the moment you fall." The audience roared in approval, clapping, cheering, capturing every second. Mason collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, his empire gone. But as Elena stepped off the stage, Victor leaned close and whispered something only she could hear. Her steps faltered, her face paling, because the truth Victor revealed about her child would change everything Elena thought she knew, and Mason's punishment was far from over. Victor's whisper echoed in Elena's mind long after the gala ended. "Your child will never carry Mason's stain, I will see to that." Those words carried her through the days that followed, days when Mason's world collapsed entirely. The evidence Elena revealed spread across every screen, every paper. Mason Hart exposed for fraud. 2 women, 2 pregnancies, 1 man's fall. His face, once a mask of ambition, was now the emblem of disgrace. Authorities moved quickly. The documents Victor had already submitted sealed Mason's fate. Charges of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery stacked against him like a mountain too high to climb. Reporters camped outside his office only to capture images of locked doors, abandoned desks, and angry former partners. Mason Hart, once a man who dreamed of empires, was now a man waiting for prison. But Elena did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She had stood in the storm long enough to know that revenge, though sweet, was not the same as healing. Her focus shifted entirely to her child. The day she gave birth, the world seemed to pause. The sun rose over the city in gentle hues of pink and gold, flooding her hospital room with warmth. When the baby was placed in her arms, Elena wept, not from sorrow but from a joy she thought she had lost forever. Tiny fingers curled around her own, fragile but determined, and she whispered, "We made it, you and me." Victor arrived later, his expression softer than Elena had ever seen. He stood over the crib, gazing down at the child with surprising tenderness. "He will grow up free," Victor said quietly. "Free from Mason's shadow, free from his cruelty. Because you, Elena, chose strength." For all his ruthlessness, Victor's words carried something unexpected: respect. He had watched her endure humiliation, rise from despair, and face Mason without fear. In his eyes, she was no longer the ordinary schoolteacher's daughter. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had written her own destiny. Meanwhile, Tasha gave birth weeks later. Though still heartbroken, she began to see herself more clearly. For years she had believed love meant tolerating cruelty, that her weight and insecurities made her unworthy. Mason had exploited that, feeding off her vulnerability. But when her father embraced her at the hospital, holding her newborn grandchild, she realized she was not unworthy. She had simply given her heart to the wrong man. Both women had been betrayed by Mason. But now both had found strength in their children and the truth of their worth. And Mason? His trial was swift. Evidence stacked higher than his lawyer's excuses. Elena sat quietly in the courtroom as the judge read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Mason's face was pale, his hands trembling as the sentence was delivered. Years in prison. His empire dissolved, his name disgraced. When he was led away in handcuffs, Elena felt no triumph, only closure. He had gambled with lives, with love, with trust, and now he paid the price. The world moved on. Mason Hart became a cautionary tale told in boardrooms and dinner parties. Never be a Mason, people whispered. His arrogance, once admired, was now a warning etched in shame. Elena, however, built anew. With Victor's backing, she resumed her passion for teaching, this time not just in classrooms but in community programs funded through Carrington Charities. She spoke to young mothers, to women who had been abandoned, to children who had been told they were not enough. Her story became more than survival. It became inspiration. At one conference, she stood before a crowd of women, her son playing quietly nearby. She said, "Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing to rise after you've been broken." Mason thought I was ordinary. But ordinary women carry extraordinary strength, and no betrayal can erase that. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what mattered most were the faces of women who wiped their tears, who saw themselves in her words. Victor often watched her speak, his face unreadable, but in his silence there was pride. He had not only protected his empire, but in helping Elena, he had found something far rarer, redemption for his own failures as a father. Tasha, too, healed, slowly but surely, learning that her worth was never measured by Mason's gaze. And Elena? She found peace. Nights no longer haunted by Mason's cruelty were now filled with lullabies and soft laughter. Days once burdened by shame were now filled with purpose. She raised her child not with fear of the past, but with hope for the future. The city never forgot the scandal, but Elena was no longer defined by it. She was defined by her rise. One evening, as she rocked her son to sleep by the window, the lights of the city twinkling outside, she whispered, "We are free, and we are stronger than ever." Because Mason Hart's betrayal had ended one chapter of her life, but it had also given birth to another. The story of a woman who refused to be silenced, who turned humiliation into dignity, and who proved that even in the face of cruelty, love and resilience would always prevail. And though Mason sat in prison, counting the years of his downfall, Elena was already building a legacy her child would be proud of. A legacy of strength, truth, and unshakable hope. So that's how the story comes to an end. And if you, my wonderful friends, are still here with me right now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in some way. Maybe it reminded you of your own pain, maybe of your own strength, or maybe it showed you that even in betrayal, there's always a chance to rise again. Life often hands us trials we never asked for. People we trust break us. Dreams we build get shattered. But as the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Think about that. The very pain that tried to destroy us can become the very reason we rise stronger. Elena's journey is not just a story, it's a mirror. A mirror for anyone who has ever been left behind, underestimated, or broken down by someone they once loved. She chose not to remain a victim. She chose to stand, to fight, and to protect the future of her child. And in that choice, she found freedom. Seneca once wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body." And isn't that true? Every difficulty, every betrayal, every heartbreak is like weight on our soul. Heavy? Yes. Painful? Yes. But when we lift it, when we survive it, we grow stronger than we ever thought possible. So maybe tonight, ask yourself, What pain in your life can you turn into strength? What betrayal can you turn into wisdom? And what broken chapter can you rewrite into a story of dignity? If you felt something in your heart tonight, I ask you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need this reminder, and subscribe to our channel. Because together, we're not just telling stories, we're healing, we're rising, and we're reminding each other that no darkness lasts forever. Stay strong, my friends. The best chapters are still ahead.